What if I told you Michael Afton's British accent could actually have huge ramifications for the lore of the franchise?
So, you guys had some thoughts. Right, who'd have thought that people might actually enjoy me making a FNAF video that was actually a thinly veiled attempt to teach you some linguistics, which in turn was an even more thinly veiled attempt at trying to just take the piss out of Americans. Now, if you haven't seen that video, it's probably worth pausing this one, pulling up a new tab, pulling up that video and watching that one before you watch this one so you understand what the hell I'm talking about. Don't worry, I'll be here when you get back. Well, technically I'll be there as well because I'm recommending my own video, but I'm going off on a tangent. But you guys had plenty of thoughts and notes and theories of your own. And if I'm going to start running with this whole the Aftons are British thing, I should probably acknowledge what some of you have said first before trying to build my own timeline. So let's consider this my part 1.5 of being aggressively British about FNAF. And let's look over your comments, starting with... I know, I even pointed it out in the video to try and get ahead of it. And as a bit of a vexillology nerd myself, I was actually genuinely really disappointed in myself for not spotting that before I recorded the video. But more importantly, I was not going to re-record the whole thing just because of that. And technically putting the flag upside down is supposed to be a sign of distress, so let's go with I put it upside down because I'm in a constant state of distress at the existence of American English. Yeah, let's go with that. Yeah, for those of you that didn't realise, there is an orientation to the Union flag. So the cross here for the St. Patrick's cross, the red diagonal line here, I can't hold up the whole thing to show it off very well, but as you can see, that isn't centred in there. So technically, this is the right way up, and this is not. So I did get a few suggestions about William Afton being a Mormon. And my initial thought was, if he's British, he's not really going to be a Mormon. I don't think there's that many Mormons in the UK. And then I looked up the statistics, and I was actually surprised to see there's over 180,000 members of the Mormon Church in the UK as of 2019. However, this stuff with William Afton isn't in 2019. This is a while ago, so I had to look back into old statistics. And that number grew a lot through the 60s, 70s, and 80s especially. So before then, it was hovering at around 6,000. So chances are William Afton being Mormon, not impossible, but very unlikely, and more likely that if that was the case, his family was American, moved to the UK, then he moved back. Though again, this is me spiralling whilst recording this. This would be... I'm theorising now that William Afton was probably born not long after World War II. So potentially this is me now coming up with the idea of his family was American, moved over to the UK, or at least over to Europe because of the war. Like his father or something was in part of the war, got moved over there, and then just sort of stayed, or like at least had the kid in the UK, and then he grew up. William grows up in the UK post World War II. And that's actually making some sense to me, as you can tell. Not scripting this video quite as much. But yeah, I need to make sure I make a note of that one. But the big reason why Afton being a Mormon would be important here is because specifically him moving to Utah, which I've looked up, and the majority of the population of Utah is Mormon. The number of Mormons in Utah is more than double any other US state. Though obviously I will admit all of this comes from a viewpoint of someone who doesn't really know that much about Mormons. Like I said, no real first-hand experience with any Mormons. It's, even though I said there's a lot more in the UK than I thought there were, it's still a relatively small number. And they're likely concentrated in specific parts of the country where I don't live. But speaking of Utah, there were some people who brought up the idea of looking specifically at the demographics of Hurricane Utah. Not Utah as a whole, but more the local area. And so I looked up about the percentage of people who are foreign-born living in Hurricane, and where those people are actually from. So about 4.5% of the population of Hurricane Utah is foreign-born, which is actually well below the state average of about 8.9%. And the majority of those foreign-born people are actually from Latin America rather than being from the UK. And obviously in the original video I quoted statistics about Utah having a much higher population of people with British ancestry. Someone has suggested that that could be down more to less of them actually having more people with British ancestry and just more people that can prove it. And that Mormons, from what was suggested in the comments, keep a more detailed record of their ancestry, which might make it easier for them to prove that they have British heritage. So yeah, it could be less of a case of there are more people who are of British heritage and just more people who can prove it. Now this next comment, I honestly did not know how to react to this because I don't know who that is. I looked it up and saw it. You decide. This is Odessa Cubbage from Half-Life 2. You're going to have to tell me on this one. And I also have no idea if that's a compliment or not. Now, obviously, there were a lot of theories around, why potentially William could have moved to the US from the UK. And the one that came up a lot was about him moving post-divorce. And that's how he goes first without the kids. And then the kids come later. So that's how potentially William's in the US earlier in the timeline. Michael still grows up in the UK to develop his British accent. And then he moves over to the US and we see him in FNAF 4. There are... it works to an extent, I think, but there are certain limitations on it. Number one, it feels as though Michael can't have moved so late that it's not, it feels like something that would come up at some point in the story if he'd moved so much late, if he spent so much time away from his dad. Not impossible, but it's still something to keep in mind of if that was supposed to be part of the story, why is it never being mentioned at all? But the bigger thing that limits that is more that, assuming that there is, we're saying that all of the kids are born in the UK, that there's a singular Mrs. Afton, and they have the kids, and then they divorce, and then William moves to the US without them. William is still limited by the fact he needs to be in the same country as Mrs. Afton for the kids to, be produced. I don't think William is making a kid halfway around the world from the person that he's divorced. So yeah, it's certainly not impossible that William and the kids move separately. It's something that I'm absolutely sort of splitting into separate events when I'm trying to piece together a timeline of William moving to the UK, or to the US, sorry, and the kids moving to the US. But it still, as I said, has that limitation of wherever the kids are born, he kind of needs to be there 9 months beforehand. And yes, I'm dancing around the terminology because talking about William Afton in that context is weird. So yeah, I'm moving on to the next idea about the kids potentially being homeschooled. So that gives them more of an opportunity to be basically shielded away from American accents, to keep their British accents. The only issue is, in FNAF 4, we see with Michael and the Crying Child specifically, they do go out in public. They, the kids know who they are. It's not like they've just been, we're only ever seeing them go, like, getting shepherded off to the pizzeria and then quietly moved away and they're not talking to the other kids. They know the kids in the area. It's not weird to see them about. We're seeing them go out in public, several times there, and it's not a weird thing for them to be doing. So even if they are homeschooled, they're not being completely separated from their surroundings. And I think we've seen that enough in FNAF 4 to sort of rule out that they're basically, being kept just inside the house, like he's had them in the nightmare chambers the whole time and he's only playing British radio in there. Now, of course, I had to bring up the theory that a lot of people have said they quite like, of the idea that, the kids are American, but William is forcing the accent on them. Again, that is one that I'm still sort of sitting on as it's entirely plausible to me. When I say entirely plausible, I'm not necessarily saying it's entirely plausible to do that to someone in real life. I don't know. Like, I don't know how easy it is to force someone to have an accent, but at least it's, it's in my list of things that I'm keeping in as possibilities when I'm trying to put together this, William is British timeline that I keep mentioning. And now I did bring up the whole, thing about Michael potentially being adopted and then the whole, but actually he looks too much like William. And then someone came up with this idea that Michael Afton is a clone. No, we're not doing this. We're not, no. The main reason I'm saying we're not doing this is not necessarily because it's a dumb idea and because it's wrong, even though it's a dumb idea and it's wrong, and please don't do that in the story, please don't let that be right, Scott. But more that we're not doing this because if I allow it to be, become too much of a thought, I will try too hard to defend it, because I probably could. Like, I'd back myself. There are a lot of dumb theories that I'd back myself to be able to make a semi-convincing argument about, because FNAF is so open-ended with all its information. It feels very easy to make a lot of claims seem plausible. And I kind of want to abuse that and try and defend this idea, but I'm semi-banning myself, at least for now, from trying, because I will spend far too long on an idea I know is wrong. But away from that crazy idea, you guys just have some fun headcanons, as a lot of you call them, where I just wanted to shout out a few of them, like Michael getting locked in the nightmare chambers for calling it math, which fair enough. Her Majesty's Royal Fred Fassington's Jolly Good Fish and Chips Emporium. I had to make sure I got the name right. That whole thing, brilliant. I kind of want to make that one actually true. I kind of want to try and defend that one as reality. And let's be honest, a chippy, way better than a weird, creepy pizzeria. Briefly back to the Mormon thing, there was suggestions of William being an adult convert, which, yeah, sure, like, it's not impossible. It's not, like, it's one of the many things in FNAF where there's nothing really to support it or go against it. There was one suggestion of Mike getting sent back to the UK after Bite of 83, which, again, not really much to support or go against it, but yeah, it could work. It could be him, him getting sent off to some sort of boarding school or whatever. Then there's the fun one of Mrs. Afton left William because he was trying to force the kids into having British accents. Like, this whole thing of, people saying that, bad things are happening to William because he's trying to force these kids into British accents is probably, to me, it's like you're trying to make him seem more sympathetic. If William's evil because no one will agree with him that the British accent is better, then you're making it sound like William's right, and that's kind of, you can't justify child murder or, nightmare chambers or basically anything William Afton has ever done. But if you were going to try... No, I'm going to have to put the disclaimer here, aren't I? Child murder is bad. Child torture is bad. Don't do it. Even if they say math. And yes, it still pains me to say it, even just for, quoting the word. It's just wrong. There was also a suggestion about circus babies actually originally being British, then going to the US and failing, and then, William getting bought out and all that. Which, again, at the moment feels like there's not really much to disprove that, but it feels like just with a lot of the stuff with, we're going into the earlier parts of the timeline in the games going forward and some of the stories we're getting and that. And a lot of, the weird stuff with Circus Baby showing up in a lot of the earlier points feels like that's one that won't be true. Like, that is one that we are going to get something that would contradict that. Then again, I also feel like we're going to get something that contradicts William being British altogether, so. But one thing that did keep coming up a lot in people's, theories and headcanons and whatnot was stuff to do with Mrs. Afton. And a lot of the stuff that I keep trying to put together keeps circling back to Mrs. Afton, who, again, might not even actually be a singular character. So potentially that is one where I might end up doing that, trying to go down that route of figuring out what the hell I think is going on with Mrs. Afton before trying to put together a timeline fully. So there's potentially, I did put out in, the community post, whatever they call it now on YouTube about, the videos I've got coming up. Potentially I slot in a Mrs. Afton one before I try and do the timeline. But outside of all the, theories and that, you guys also had a few notes that I just wanted to bring up in this video. The first one being that TD hybrid sound that I talked about, it's called an alveolar tap, which is the name I didn't come across when I was looking it up that much. But it's good to have someone point out. There's a few different bits of, people who know more linguistics than I do pointing stuff out in the comments. So there's a few points where, it is worth reading. It's occasionally worth venturing into the YouTube comments. Thankfully, you guys were actually really nice last time. Yeah, beyond that, there was also a few people who are, kids of British parents living in the US, or people living in different countries to where their parents were born or where they were initially born, talking about their specific scenarios with their accents, and they were all, a lot of them were very different to each other, which shows that trying to come up with trying to conclusively prove something based off of accents is not very good. It's not a great way of proving something, because everything is specific to people's different scenarios. I do try to mention this in the last video. I probably worded it in a weird way. I'm probably wording it in a weird way now, but it's anyone's accent is, like I said, it's their accent. It will be based off of their very specific circumstances and their very specific way of seeing the world and everything. So trying to fully decide, how someone's accent, changes over time, especially a fictional character where we've barely seen any of their life, is nigh on impossible. But it's a bit more of the fun of, trying to use that to figure it out, but also understanding what the intent was when those characters were given those accents when the games were made. The next thing that people brought up, a couple of you specifically brought up, was when I listed Agent Smith from The Matrix as having a British accent. Yeah, that was one where I think I just had a longer list of them that I started pulling out from, of characters with British accents, villains with British accents. and his name was on there, and pulled it out without quite remembering that his accent wasn't really British. It was a weird mishmash of nonsense. Like, people, like, even in the comments with the people who brought it up said he actually had an American accent, and he actually had, like, a weird mixture of accent. Yeah, it's really hard to place what Hugo Weaving was going for, I'm gonna be honest. Yeah, that's just one that I wanted to note there. It was probably a bad example for me to have used. The rest of them I stand by. It was just that one that was, yeah, weird choice from me. Also got a few notes from Americans saying that, you know, oh, we don't have a homogenous accent, you know, it's not just the UK that varies. And yeah, it will be the same in the US where, you know, the accent will change slowly as you go through different places. It's not like there is a singular southern accent and a singular, you know, West Coast accent and whatnot. It will change slowly as you go through. It's just the reason why I point it out in the UK more than the US is simply just geographical size. You get roughly, so obviously trying to count how many accents there are is impossible. Like I said, there is no defining line between accents. But a lot of the things where people have tried to almost quantify the number of accents, roughly speaking, there's said to be a similar number of accents of, you know, speaking English in the UK as there is in all of North America. But geographically and, you know, size-wise, they are not the same size, and that's why it's so, you know, that's the big difference for me between the US and the UK, is that you get that changing of accents in a much smaller geographical region than you do in the US. You know, the UK, relatively speaking, is very small, yet has so many variations of its own language. The next note, someone pointed out that the British people said soccer first. Yes, I'm aware, it's an abbreviation of association football. That's the name of the sport officially, is association football. It was called soccer because of the abbreviation of association. And that was to differentiate it from rugby football. But here's the thing, we stopped saying it. It's dumb. But yeah, honestly, I think the whole soccer thing is, you know, more because, yeah, we know we said it first, but then you started saying it and it stopped being cool. The moment you start doing it, we're like, no, dumb, wrong. It's basically just another one of the whole, yeah, we just want to say Americans are wrong, usually because you are. But, you know, one other little note that I just wanted to, you know, that got brought up in the comments that I just want to point to and go, no, you are false. That is categorically, statistically false. No. There we go. That's my one sports reference I get to do. For clarification, what he's trying to claim, it's a sports rivalry thing. So I'm a Norwich City fan. Our rivals are Ipswich Town. They haven't beaten us in 15 years. That's the most important thing. Yeah, basically, I'm just not allowing that misinformation to just sit in the comments. Right, back to FNAF. Sorry, I got riled up about football. It's mildly easy to do that to me. But back to FNAF. Someone brought up the idea of the animatronics accents being a key to telling you who made them. The thing is, I don't know that any of the animatronics themselves actually have British accents. For example, Circus Baby doesn't actually have a British accent. That's only when she is mimicking Elizabeth. Like, Ballora doesn't have a British accent either. And heck, Funtime Freddy was nearly German. So while the idea would have been cool, I don't think it quite works. I'm sure someone will tell me if I'm wrong and I'm misremembering or whatever in the comments on this one. But yeah, I don't quite think that one works. Also, I so wish we got German Freddy Fazbear. That would have been so much fun. Now, I also got a suggestion that William himself could actually be putting on the British accent because he's a weird, theatrical, dramatic guy, which is kind of true, you know. And even my mate Z, who's not a FNAF guy, but watched the video more for the linguistic stuff, even suggested the idea, you know, of him having to be an actor of sorts would mean that he wants to be more theatrical, and back then people would be putting on more of the, you know, RP accent and everything to try and sound like a fancier person. I don't think that quite works in the actor sense, given it's, you know, he's running a pizzeria. But yeah, I think Afton's, you know, tendency to be more theatrical would, you know, work more with him doing the RP accent, him trying to sound fancier and more important. I don't quite think he'd go all the way British without being British. It would be a weird choice, I think, for him to want to sound, you know, to make him British sounding because he's trying to be more theatrical. Him making himself sound posher, sure, but I think going all the way British, maybe not so much. Also, I mentioned my mate Z in there as well because he's the one that does the Bad Psychics podcast, which I'm occasionally on. So go be nice to Z. Go watch some of that. I ramble about, you know, other things occasionally. So if you enjoy my rambling, you'll get that occasionally over there. I did also see a few, you know, shout outs in the comments for Bonk Boy and, you know, their video before of talking about why William's British accent is actually so important to the story and why it helps differentiate him as a character. I hadn't seen those videos before I made mine. I think I'd seen one of them suggested a couple of times to me whilst I was making them, and just didn't get around to it. I sort of made a mental note of, go find that video. And then when I had enough people, shout at me in the comments about it, I went, okay, and that is the person I was seeing crop up. Watch that. And yeah, it's good to know that I'm not the only person that seems to care about this. I did also get a suggestion going to a very specific point in the FNAF lore to how this could help limit some ideas down, was the one you should not have killed. Which, yes, I know is putting my foot into a bit of a minefield on this one again. I think I've mentioned this, some of my thoughts on this before. But people suggesting that background voice not having a British accent limits some choices as to who that could be. I'm more specifically talking about the idea of, does the one you should not have killed, seemingly not really having a British accent, rule out Mike being the vengeful spirit? Now, I need to go back and really listen to that voice to see if that truly is, not a British accent. But it does feel like if that was supposed to be Mike, that voice might line up a bit better, not just in terms of accent, but in terms of age. It's very clearly supposed to be a little kid. And we've never seen Mike portrayed as a little kid at any point. Like, the earliest we've seen him in the timeline is him as a teenager in 1983. So while I won't sit here and say, it's a disproved theory, I do think that makes it less likely, just because that voice doesn't line up. Not just, like I said, not just in terms of the accent, but more so the age, I think, is the point that goes against, the vengeful spirit being Michael Afton. Just because it doesn't sound anything like how we've heard him speak, and doesn't represent any sort of version of that character that we've seen. It would be a weird sort of choice to go from, to show him with a, small child's voice, rather, when we've never seen him as a small child, if we're trying to be told that that voice is Michael's. Well, I don't think that's the only thing pointing against that idea. I think that is I'd say it's a relatively strong point. Relatively strong given how, strong FNAF evidence usually is. Now, this last one that got pointed out to me a couple of times in the comments semi blew my mind at one point, because I went, hang on a second, wait, what? Why did I never clock this? Midnight Motorist drives on the left-hand side of the road. Now, what the hell does that mean? Because when I first thought about it, and when I went and checked, and yes, it actually does. He's on, I say he's on the right side of the road. He's technically, he's on the left side of the road. Also, he's not always on the left side of the road. He's not always on the correct side of the road, but everyone else is on the correct side of the road. But what does that mean? Does that mean that the events of Midnight Motorist are happening in the UK or another country that drives on the left-hand side? I'm going to go with no, because that doesn't really feel like it makes a lot of sense with the rest of the lore. But also, do we really know that the game part here is actually a representation of what really happened? Obviously, the, bit where you go through the gap and then you've got the extra bit with, Mustard Man and all that. Like, that is seemingly a proper lore thing. The game part beforehand, I don't think is. I think that is literally just the in-universe game, in the same way Fruity Maze isn't an actual direct depiction of what happened. It's just, that is a, initially, it's just the normal version of the game that then glitches to show some lore. I think this part of Midnight Motorist isn't a depiction of reality. Now, what that could tell you, though, is that William made that game, or at least it's a British game, with them all, by default driving on the left-hand side, which therefore makes it superior. Okay, that is another note I got in the comments of people saying that, you can't call something objectively better. I think this is also the point where I need to clarify, that's how British humour works a lot of the time. You just sort of say something with a straight face when it's supposed to be intended as a bit of a joke. So, is it actually objectively better? Probably not. But I'm going to keep saying it. But I was about to say that rounds up all of your comments. It doesn't really. There was a hell of a lot of comments. So thank you very much to everyone who took any amount of time to write something, their own thoughts or anything on, after that video. But going forward, what do I think I'm actually going to keep running with? Because obviously I spat out a lot of ideas over these last two videos around, the whole idea of the Aftons being British. And like I said, I'm trying to piece it together in a, into a timeline. I'm sort of trying to take events and put them in an order and then, draw the lines between them that make some sort of sense, which is how, bloody timeline works. Good job, Michael, you described a timeline. But I think, obviously, the big thing that I'll keep moving forward with is the idea of William Afton being British. I'd say I've sort of planted my flag in the ground there. I'm fully doing that at this point. To me, Game Afton is British. There is no other reasonable explanation as to why Scott would have been okay with giving him a British accent if there was no intention for him to be British. The kids, I think there's more wiggle room around, but I think William himself has to be British for the accent to make proper sense. Otherwise, Scott's just doing random stuff for just, purely to try and confuse us, I guess. And wait, that sounds completely like something Scott would do. But like I said, I'm sticking with it. William Afton is British. The kids, maybe. Mrs. Afton, does she exist? Is there a singular Mrs. Afton? That's another problem to try and solve. But yeah, that's where I'm sort of moving forward with the ideas and taking on board your ideas as well, sort of figuring out what fits into, what I'm sort of putting in as my flags in the ground. This is the bit that doesn't move. How does everything around it move? How does that explain, what can explain why those things have to go in those positions in the timeline? But anyway, I've got a timeline to write. I've got a timeline to write that I've given myself. I've given myself this idea of having to figure out what the hell's going on. This is Afton. I've got a few other videos I'm working on. I need to get on with that. If you've got any interest in any of those things I've got coming in the pipeline, make sure you subscribe, and I will see you when you're older.